If you have any questions, please type them on the chat box and direct it to Inessa Collier, and she will be reading your questions during our Q&A session, which we will have after the interview. And now I hand you over to our president, Mr. Naveen Sitaram, who will be introducing our guest speaker for tonight.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that very kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, as a society, we ascribe to the philosophy of conscious capitalism, and we advocate ESG and impact investing approaches in doing so. So our featured guest and alma mater this evening, Dr. Gillian Tett, is one of the world's leading thought leaders, illuminating how conscious capitalism continues its evolution, and we are very honored to host her. Ladies and gentlemen, the world of economic, business, and finance, as we know it today, or many know it today, reference their inspiration from Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, celebrating that competition is a source for innovation and growth. But that book was predicated on Smith's previous one, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, that commerce and markets would only work, or maybe be more sustainable, with a shared moral framework, essentially binding the relevant stakeholders. The proponents of capitalism and technology innovation, however, seem to reduce Smith's body of work to extract from the wealth of nations without acknowledging the work which underpinned it, the moral theory of moral sentiments. However, in the aftermath of the financial crisis in 2008, Tett recognizes that Smith's two books are coming together again in the somewhat resuscitated stakeholder capitalism model, as he helps us come out of our silos to understand how to maneuver in these new and exciting times. Dr. Gillian Tett is the chair of the editorial board and editor-at-large of the US Financial Times. She is a British author and journalist who writes weekly columns covering a range of economic, financial, political, and social issues. In 2006, in the middle of her famous ethnographic research on JP Morgan, carried out from 2005 to 7, she predicted the 2008 financial crisis, uncovering the insular culture which led to the creation of financial instruments with little basis that could cause severe economic disruption. This was later recounted in a book, Fool's Gold, winner of the Financial Book of the Year at the inaugural Spears Book Award, which in turn led it to another pivotal role, being featured in the documentary Inside Job, which took home the Academy Award in 2010. In 2014, she was named Columnist of the Year in the British Press Awards and was the recipient of the Royal Anthropological Institute Marsh Award. She is author of The Silo Effect and Anthro-Vision, A New Way to See in Life and Business, published in 2021 and recently came out in paperback this year, the image of which was featured on our opening. Stephen King likened Anthro-Vision to classics such as John Kenneth Galbraith's The Affluent Society and The New Industrial State, and we believe it belongs on your bookshelves as it does in that pantheon of great works. Tett's past roles at the FT have included US Managing Editor, Assistant Editor, Capital Markets Editor, Deputy Editor of the Lex column, Tokyo Bureau Chief, and reporter in Brussels and Russia. Tett went to Clare College at the University of Cambridge, where she earned a PhD in social anthropology. Ladies and gentlemen, I am ever so pleased to welcome Dr. Gillian Tett. Gillian, it's great to have you.
Thank you very much indeed. And I'm sorry to be wearing this headset, which makes me look like an air traffic controller. But
not at all.
But I hope it means that you can hear me better. And I'm delighted to have a chance to chat to you, not just because I love Cambridge, but also because I deeply appreciate the fact that you're interested in sustainability from a business perspective.
Very much so. And I would say your column, when you were doing Moral Money, was very much referenced when we started this group informally. Your work was very much an inspiration that we actually referenced. They say, oh, look, Gillian Tett has this thing out too as well. So yeah, so well done.
Oh, well, thank you.
We're very thankful.
Thank you.
All right, so just so we get into it, can you please tell us a bit about cultural anthropology, define it, and clarify your coinage, Anthro-Vision?
Well, anthropology is probably one of the least known and least understood social sciences. You know, I think most people regard it, if they know anything about it, as being something like Indiana Jones for academics. in the sense that you get, essentially asked to go off somewhere weird and wacky. This is a stereotype, weird and wacky, and go and study people who seem very exotic to you. And I'm using exotic in quotation marks because everybody seems exotic to somebody else. But anthropology came out of the 19th century Victorian academic world, where it was essentially driven by white imperialist men to whom the rest of the world looked very exotic. So they went off to exotic places, studied them, came back with great stories, often very unpleasant, imperialist, sexist, racist kind of prejudices. And essentially anthropology wasn't seen in many people's views as being sort of, colorful and interesting, but pretty useless. And one of the things I often try and tell people is that both of those perceptions are completely wrong today. One reason is that modern anthropology has very strongly rejected its initial Victorian roots. And today it's actually one of the least racist, least sexist, least imperialist disciplines. It's all about trying to champion mutual understanding and respect and appreciation for the value of every culture.
Right.
And secondly, as part of that, anthropologists today spend as much time looking at the industrialized world as the non-industrialized world, and do a lot of work inside companies and institutions and financial markets and other things like that. And so in the same way that, it pays to study culture, in the Amazon jungle, it pays to study culture in the Amazon warehouse and an Amazon boardroom. And I've used that insight throughout my journalistic career to help me look at financial and business themes within a wider cultural context. And so I wrote Anthro-Vision really to try and illustrate that, and to make the simple point that anthropology is not an irrelevant luxury. It's actually vital if we want to make sense of the world effectively today.
So how would you have segued from your work before coming into FT, right? And then how you found the applicability to that when you did get into FT to start doing work with them, and how did you use your skill set in cultural anthropology there? Yeah.
Well, my trajectory was a bit weird. I was basically doing my field work when I was at Cambridge in a place called Tajikistan, which was then Soviet Tajikistan. I did a very classic anthropology PhD, I lived in a Tajik village for a year, studied their cultural patterns, wrote my PhD, and then was rudely interrupted by a very brutal war and the breakup of the Soviet Union. And almost overnight, I went from being a sort of academic into being a de facto war correspondent, because I wanted to write about what was happening initially for human rights reasons, but then got hired by the FT as a kind of roving foreign correspondent. Discovered I really enjoyed it, and then started training myself in economics and finance because I was working at the FT. Did so initially very much as a short-term, temporary kind of strategy. Didn't think I wanted to become a financial journalist because, like many people who've been trained in culture, I thought that money was a bit dirty. And then subsequently realized that actually money's fascinating. And if you don't understand how money goes around the world, you can't really understand anything. So went down that path of studying finance and economics. And for a number of years, kept very quiet about my anthropology background because it seemed to be so low status, and hardcore grown-up business people or central bank governors or CEOs or traders generally didn't value soft sciences. It was all about mathematics and astrophysics and things like that. And it was really the 2008 financial crisis that sort of drove home to me very clearly that I shouldn't be ashamed of a social science background, that one of the reasons why the crisis had happened was because people weren't paying attention to cultural context and weren't realizing that incentives and assumptions and social networks and status systems matter enormously if you want to make sense of how finance is working, or in particular how it's not working. And that if you ignore those issues and somehow think that your wonderful algorithms can tell you what's happening in the world and predict the future, then you're going to end up with the kind of disaster you had in 2008.
Yeah. So if you could go back to that time, you started at JP Morgan 2005, yeah, as well? And then
I started at the.
Mhm.
I
Sorry,
started
go on.
writing about JP Morgan and credit derivatives in
Right.
2005.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry. And then in 2006, you came out and you acknowledged that predicting that this financial crisis could be happening, right?
Mhm.
We did it from the lens of a cultural anthropologist. Can you share how that you were able to shed light on that prediction from that perspective?
Yeah, and basically what happened was that as an anthropologist in Tajikistan, I was trained to go into this village context and spend a lot of time observing what people spoke about and what they didn't speak about, and look at the gap between rhetoric and reality, and look at how people were creating social networks, and in particular, how they were using rituals like tribal wedding rituals to both reflect and reinforce social networks and a shared framework of how they saw the world. Which sounds very abstract, but in 2005, I went to a financial conference down in the south of France, which was for the European Securitization Forum. And these were the bankers who were involved in securitization and creating credit derivatives and things like that. And I remember sitting in that conference, looking at the investment banking, rituals conference, and thinking that it was terribly like a Tajik wedding, because you basically had a set of rituals which were intended to bring together a scattered tribe. If not, in this case, it wasn't, basically the investment bankers from around the world. I hope people can hear me better now. I've just turned the thing up closer.
Yeah, you're fine.
But intended to bring together a scattered tribe and enable them to not just reaffirm their social ties, but also to reaffirm a shared worldview. And this particular shared worldview that the investment bankers had in 2005 had a number of distinctive features which they couldn't see because they took it for granted. It basically was about the fact that these financiers were elite. They were part of a network where they had more in common with each other on the same trading desks, or different trading desks at different banks or different geographies, than often with their next door neighbors. They took it for granted that essentially, no one else could understand what they were doing. They spoke a special language, not Tajik, but financial gobbledygook, or the acronyms like CDOs. They believed that, they told themselves that what they were doing was going to be good for the world. They had a really strong creation mythology, and every professional tribe has a creation mythology. And in this case, it was that securitization was going to create the perfect free market. Everything was going to be liquefied. Liquefaction was the ultimate goal, where you could trade everything. And it sounded very convincing, but it was riddled with intellectual contradictions that they couldn't see because they were such a closed social group. So, for example, they claimed that everything was being done with a mark-to-market accounting philosophy, except that the instruments they were creating were so complex that you couldn't actually get a price in the markets because they weren't trading enough. So you had to use models to put the instruments' value on the trading books. They claimed that basically, securitization was going to be good for everybody, and that it was all about sort of helping consumers. But when they made PowerPoints about what they were doing, they didn't actually put any faces into their PowerPoints at all. It was all abstract algorithms. And that sort of wasn't an accident. It reflected the fact that they were very detached from the real world and had become very unaware of the consequences of what they were doing, and very unaware of the cultural context in which they operated. So I looked at all that and I thought, yikes, this is a financial sphere that's spinning out of control, and it looks very dangerous.
Well, I know you would like to quote you have a quote from a Chinese proverb: "Fish don't see water."
Yeah, I think it's very true. That's what an anthropologist does. I mean, for the financiers, after the financial crisis, lots of people said, those bankers, they must all be evil, greedy, mad, or stupid, or all four at once. How could they have done those stupid financial products without realizing how dangerous they were? And the answer was that they were like fish in the water. Often, they told themselves convenient stories, lies, creation mythologies, which were riddled with contradictions. They believed it because it was kind of convenient. And they essentially were blind to what they couldn't see. And one of the things that anthropologists do is look at social silences and what we don't talk about. And it's very, very hard to do that, but it's crucial to do that. And that, by the way, leads me into why I became interested in sustainability.
Right. Well, there's a Noor Rubini, right? I know he came out, he was the first economist, I think, to predict it in 2007, right? And I was wondering, because I know you've done an interview with him. Have you all had any sort of way that you always sort of compare notes and share off of each other as an economist speaking to a cultural anthropologist in how to sort of diagnose the same situation?
We have a few times. I mean, we forged a certain bond because we were the two people back in 2007 who were trying to tell about what was going on. You know, he looks at it more from an economic perspective in terms of the numbers and the capital flows and things like that, which is very, very valuable. I'm not in any way, shape or form saying that it's not a valuable thing to do. I was in one level being much more basic and simply saying you have a bunch of people who are in charge of this extraordinary technology and innovation, which does have the potential to do quite a lot of good for the world, but they are so self-referencing and so cut off and in such a kind of bubble, they can't see what the impact of their footprint is on the world. And they're going to miss what's really happening. And a lot of what's happening is completely crazy. And the right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing at banks. And, they couldn't see the impact of how their models were being distorted on the ground. Yeah.
Talking about crazy happenings, in your book, Anthro-Vision, you reference a term that US military use, VUCA, right? To really look at widespread conditions of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity as it intensifies, right? And the 21st century has seen much VUCA, if I may. 9/11, the financial crisis, the effects of climate change, democracies coming under attack, social media disrupting information flows, right-wing extremism spreading across the West. Faith in governments and traditional leaders are on the wane. And to what extent do you think this contributed to the change in zeitgeist, where the spotlight illuminates stakeholder capitalism approaches, such as impact, ESG investing, sustainability, and where shareholder capitalism may be becoming increasingly questioned?
Absolutely. I'm going to shout a bit because I see we're getting some comments saying that people can't hear me. So do message me, and if it's still hard to hear, I will try another system. One of the reasons why I went from looking at anthropology to looking at sustainability is that what anthropologists are trying to do is to look at context, and to try and take a joined up view of what's happening in the world, look at it in a holistic way, and, as I say, look at social silences. Now, that sounds really abstract, but it really, really matters to how people look at business, because the late 20th century was an era when the Western world developed a series of intellectual tools which are really effective for navigating the world part of the time. And by that I mean that in the second half of the 20th century, we created economic models using all the computing power. We created, we honed and refined corporate balance sheets and created an entire industry around that. And we created big data sets, all of which try to map the world and project what is going to happen next and help you navigate. All of which are really useful often, but they all share a common flaw. And the flaw is this, that they're only as good as what you put into the model or the balance sheet or the big data set. And the boundaries of what you decide is relevant or not really matters. And what you leave out is the context, if you like. Now, if the context is stable, that might not matter much. But if the context is changing rapidly, it can matter enormously. So by way of example, 10 years ago, very few people put climate change into economic models predicting what would happen in the future. Issues like climate change or medical risk, pandemic risk, or social tensions were at best footnotes on corporate balance sheets. And I would argue that one way to make sense of what's happening in the world today is that we are experiencing a time when much of the system that we used in the late 20th century is being challenged. The assumptions that drove Davos Man were that globalization, free market capitalism, democracy, innovation were all self-evidently wonderful and were only going to become deeper and deeper over time going forward. That was the assumption that everyone assumed. That was a kind of the social silence, which was so obvious that people didn't even state it. But that underpinned how you use those intellectual tools. And today we're seeing all of those elements go into retreat. Free market capitalism is under attack. Globalization is under attack. Democracy, even innovation in some ways is being questioned. And so the stuff that we leave out of the models really, really matters. And that's the stuff that anthropologists are well trained to look at, because they look at both the noise and the silence. And it's also the stuff that's at the heart of the sustainability revolution. Because if you look at what's happened in business in the last 5 to 10 years, one way to make sense of it is say that yes, environmental, social governance issues have become really important. And there's all these metrics and frameworks. And what we're seeing now is a backlash against them. And people are saying that these metrics don't always work, which is correct, that they're sometimes flawed, correct, they're often immature, correct, etc. And people are trying to fix them and make them better, but you can sit there and obsess endlessly about ESG. The really interesting, important point, though, is that a zeitgeist shift has taken place, a mentality shift, where people have gone from saying, I'm going to look at business through tunnel vision in the way that Milton Friedman did, and just focus on my narrowly defined balance sheet and just focus on shareholder returns. Instead of that, I'm going to use lateral vision and look at some of the things that are not on the balance sheet traditionally, like the environment, and recognize that they kind of matter, and try to take a wider view of what's happening to business. And the metaphor I sometimes use is that it's a bit like, somebody walking through a wood with a compass. You can have a brilliant compass and you don't want to throw it away. That's like your economic model, because it can help. But if you just look down at your compass and just keep watching the dial, you're going to walk into a tree. So you have to look up and look around. And that's kind of what the ESG sustainability movement is trying to do. It's trying to say that actually Milton Friedman had some good ideas, but they were a product of his time, and they're not sufficient to understand the world today.
Very much so. And I'll add to that, even Professor Alex Edmonds of London Business School even would say that all companies can't be all things, right? So depending on the areas, so if your company has more value chain effect along the E, as opposed to the S, you focus more on the E, you'll get better returns on that in those ways where you can't do it all, right?
Yes.
So there's depends on where you lean in on. So yeah.
Yeah. Yes. No, I'm not being wildly prescriptive, but I guess the other point I'll make is that, again, with my anthropology lens on, when I started in journalism, most people had been trained to look at the world through the lens of Milton Friedman and through shareholderism. And, as an anthropologist, you try and look at ideas in context. And it's important to realize that Milton Friedman was a product of his time, in that he operated in an era in the mid-20th century when people thought that government could do stuff, and that people thought that government was the right group of people to fix social problems. They just come out of World War II. So, government was seen as being competent and having the authority to fix problems. And Milton Friedman also worked at a time when there was very little transparency around companies. No one really knew what companies were doing except through quarterly shareholder reports. And for the most part, the West operated with a trust model, which was hierarchical, in the sense that or vertical, people trusted experts and leaders and CEOs to kind of know what they were doing. And that's where they got their advice from. And none of those three elements are true today, in that today, people don't trust government to do stuff. All the surveys show they actually trust business leaders more. There's radical transparency, never mind, all the kind of, quarterly reporting of companies, but you have things like Glassdoor telling you what employees really think. You have satellites whizzing overhead telling you which companies are emitting emissions, all that kind of stuff. Very different situation. And you have a world where people are increasingly trusting other people on a horizontal basis, their peer group, through digital tools, not necessarily in a hierarchical vertical basis.
Right.
So all of that means that trying to embrace a shareholder first approach, I don't think works even if you want to be a shareholder. If you want to protect shareholder interest today, you need to have lateral vision and think about what didn't used to be on the balance sheet to protect shareholder interest too.
Very much so. All the more reason why ESG and impact frameworks are becoming more mainstream.
Yeah.
So if I could stay on get a little bit deeper into the themes of VUCA, that we've seen like the social and environmental tipping points, right? And the acceptance around having, let's say, voluntary targets, ESG targets. So the question arises, if voluntary ESG targets, is it enough, or do we need stronger legal rules and regulations to get to the right behavior as actors in finance?
Well, I'm personally a strong believer in having some, important role for government. And for example, I think that there should be a mandatory requirement to, embed a carbon price into your corporate accounting and reporting and your forward planning. I think that companies should be forced to try and disclose what's happening in supply chains and try to indicate what's happening in terms of their emissions. Now, the systems are not perfect, but they should at least try within a large error bar. They shouldn't be allowed to go and just pollute endlessly. I think there is a place for governments and regulations, but that's not the only place. I think you need to basically use both a stick and a carrot, and you need to also encourage people to recognize that if they are trying to do a more conscious, more sustainable set of policies, shareholders and customers will hopefully reward them too.
Well, there are people who say that the current legal definition, right, around ESGs and so on suffices. Is there a need to have a change for more sustainable investing?
You mean in terms of like impact investing, or?
Yes, ESG and impact investing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's important to realize that ESG and impact investing is not the same. The way I describe it sometimes is that, there are three incentives driving this whole zeitgeist shift. Some people, a tiny minority, want to actively make the world better. They're actively trying to change the world for the better. And that's really impact investing. I salute it, strongly support it. Great. That was the original genesis of the whole movement. There are other people who just want to avoid doing harm. So they're not necessarily campaigning and activists. They just want to make sure that they're not screwing up the world any more than it's already screwed up. And then there are people who, frankly, want to avoid doing harm to themselves. And people who recognize that actually, if you ignore ESG or sustainability issues today, you're likely to harm yourself, because you will suffer reputational scandals, you may lose your investors, your customers, your employees, you might face fines, or you might face stranded assets. And in many ways, one of the big drivers of ESG in the last 3 or 4 years has been people realizing that it's also about self-defense. Now, you can be, purist about this and say that's disgusting and companies are pretending to embrace ESG for all the wrong reasons. They're not actually trying to change the world, they're just trying to defend themselves. And that's totally true. Totally true. I prefer to see it more in terms of the way that, you know, the zeitgeist has changed dramatically, and so dramatically because of what the early activists did, that, you know, today you actually end up, you know, risking yourself if you don't embrace ESG rather than if you do.
Right.
And as someone who saw real revolutions originally in places like Tajikistan, you know, I know that what creates a revolution is not, or a successful revolution, it's not when a small minority of activists start shouting. It's when the silent majority decide that it's not worth their while to resist change and get swept along with it. So that's kind of what's happened in ESG in the last few years. But precisely because, you know, some companies are using ESG as self-defense, you know, it creates all kinds of questions about hypocrisy, greenwashing, muddled motives, and unsurprisingly, people attack it for that reason. Yeah.
I want to bring into the conversation around the emerging economies in the developing world, right? Because I recall you're quite supportive of trying to mainstream ESG in our conversation in the developing world context. So from where you sit in the FT, what do you think are some of the challenges the emerging economies may need to overcome as they attempt, you know, the blended finance approaches that are being spoken of?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that question, because it's going to be the World Bank IMF meeting next week, and this is going to be a big issue. The most immediate challenge is that many poor countries right now are in a worsening situation and feeling pretty angry. And that's entirely understandable. You know, the global recession, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the impact on emerging energy markets and agricultural markets, the pandemic, all of that has hit the emerging markets really hard and set back many measures of development a long way. And that's really depressing. And it means that emerging markets don't have the luxury of money to actually go forth and try to, you know, embrace green technologies, do transition technologies, etc., etc. And, you know, that's a real issue. And emerging markets also argue, quite understandably, that, you know, essentially it's very unfair to be depriving them of energy when the developed world has enjoyed the energy miracle in recent years. It's unfair to deprive them of energy in order to be green and rescue the developed world when they're trying to grow. So that's a bundle of issues that are making people pretty angry. They're doubly angry right now because the developed world has not provided the assistance it had promised to help them do loss and mitigation. And there isn't even the funding available for transition finance. Very striking that you've got all these trillions floating around in Western financial system for transition finance, but not going to the emerging markets, and that's where it's needed. You know, how do you fix that? The answer is blended finance. Why is it not happening? Partly because institutions like the World Bank have been incredibly timid and very, very disappointingly slow to innovate. There's rising anger about that. And I think that this is going to be a flashpoint at next week's World Bank IMF meetings.
Yeah, very much so. Because I'm also in touch with some in developing countries who are trying to mainstream this. And these are the exact points we just referenced, the things they mentioned as well.
Yeah. No, I mean, we've written quite a bit about this on Moral Money. And it's a huge issue. And in fact, I'm going to be writing again about it next Monday, because there's a group called the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance that have come out today with a very hard-hitting paper about this. There was a group, there's the OECD's got a conference tomorrow about this. The Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance is coming out tomorrow with a very hard-hitting paper. The OECD's coming out with a paper. You know, there's a lot of action, a lot of frustration, and a lot of people are pretty angry about it, and understandably so.
Well, we're going to go to Q&A. I have one last question, right? Which is just that given that we've gone through what you have and you've kind of used the, the methodology and the framework of Anthro-Vision, what would you say if you were to say succinctly to audience members, or even in the world of finance, what would be the advantages of adopting an Anthro-Vision?
I think it basically teaches you to look around corners. It teaches you to realize the things you're not seeing that could pose future risks and opportunities. It explains to you why bright people sometimes behave in ways that are incredibly stupid. And above all else, it makes you realize that, you might seem to be a brilliant financier and a brilliant banker. You might have the best models in the world, you think, the best algorithms, the best trading tools, whatever else. At the end of the day, you're human, and you're actually no different from any group of humans anywhere in the world. Be that, as I say, the Amazon jungle, be that an Amazon warehouse, be it anywhere else. You have all kinds of incentives and assumptions and biases, which are totally natural and normal. That's part of being human, but they can distort your vision. And if you want to be an effective human being, you need to step back and see them effectively. And the last thing I'd say is that I think a lot of financiers and business people in the last few years learned about why it pays to know a bit of psychology, like Danny Kahneman's thinking fast and thinking slow. It makes you a better decision maker.
For sure.
But that's about individual brains and the biases in your individual brain. What anthropology does is look at our collective social patterns and look at social and cultural biases. And it pays to understand those because you make better decisions.
Very elegant way to close. Thank you so much for that, Gillian. If we can maybe go to the Q&A now, there's a bunch of questions coming in. So the first question is coming from Celia, and Celia asks, if we have a global and deep recession, is there an expectation that government will become more important and lateral vision less so, at least for a couple of years?
I think if there's a global and deep recession, what's going to happen is really two or three things. Firstly, that I do think the relationship between business and government is being renegotiated. And it's important to realize that you go through pendulum swings in history. And in many ways, the last time the world had a bout of high inflation, recession, stagflation, geopolitical tension was in the 1970s. And that was a kind of hinge decade when we went from a zeitgeist where the government had been in charge, and essentially post-World War II, people had come out of a kind of wartime economy with the assumption that it was normal and natural to have heavy state involvement. In the 1970s, you had a pendulum swing, and essentially the rise of Thatcherism, Reaganism, all of those isms led to deregulation, people falling in love with the free market philosophy, etc., etc. What we're having today, in some ways, is a swing back, because post 2002, we saw heavy state involvement in the financial system, both in terms of banks, then in terms of central banks getting involved in financial markets, and they're still involved. I mean, quantitative easing was a massive, massive trillion-dollar wave of meddling in the functioning of markets. You've got pandemic, which has basically justified and given credibility to the idea of the government getting involved. In a country like the UK with a nominally right-wing government, you've got this incredible embrace of paternalistic government involvement in economic affairs. The energy crisis is intensifying that. So I think the relationship between government and business is being rewritten. And I think the role of business in society is being rewritten. Because if we are going to have a new wave of austerity and pain and potential demands for burden sharing, the kind of 1980s mantra of yuppies and the greed is good culture, and it's okay for business to do whatever it wants and just make money, I don't think is going to be culturally accepted.
Yeah. Agree.
So it comes back to the question of cultural context matters.
All right. So we also have Lizelle. She asks, how does one apply an Anthro-Vision approach to running one's business?
I think one does it in several ways. Firstly, to recognize the really obvious point that not everyone thinks like you. Essentially, anthropology involves a three-part intellectual process. The first is to try to make the strange familiar, to deliberately try and put yourself into an environment and a set of people who think differently from you. And you do that, to basically realize that simple, obvious point that we all forget, which is just because it's your worldview doesn't mean it's everyone's worldview. And if you're running a company with any type of difference amongst employees or any type of difference in industrial training or professional backgrounds, you need to become humble enough to realize that the way that you speak and think is not the same as everybody else, and be curious about trying to embrace a different mentality from time to time. And by the way, if you run a global company, that's doubly true. And you should be curious about trying to think yourself into someone else's mindset, both because you need to understand difference in today's world, but also because the single best way to look at yourself clearly and see your own biases clearly is to essentially jump out of your skin and look back at yourself as others do. You said earlier the wonderful Chinese proverb that a fish can't see water. None of us can see the water we swim in clearly and the biases that haunt our brains unless we jump out of our water, go swim with other fish, go hang out in another fishbowl, and then look back. And when you do that, you can see all kinds of things that, frankly, the bankers in 2005 were not doing or not seeing. And that's really helpful as a business person. You see social silences. How do you build that into your everyday life? It's tough. I know that, because one of the terrible paradoxes that confront any business person, whether they are in a big organization and trying to climb the hierarchy, or if they're an entrepreneur, is that everyone's so damn busy that you have to focus and be driven, and you have to block out the world. And we live in a world of growing technological complexity where anyone who's in charge of a body of knowledge, that gives them power, and they are encouraged to focus on that because that's how you get ahead. Totally understandable. So the question of how you build that into the world is tough. But what I'd say is try periodically, however you can, to find ways to jump out of your fishbowl, whether it's talking to somebody else different, whether it's building a tiny bit of slack into your week to roam and collide with the unexpected, whether it's actually asking other people what they think and really listening, whether it's going online and getting another point of view from a different website. Whatever you can do to just jump out of your fishbowl periodically will make you a more effective fish.
Very much so. We have next one is Kevin. Kevin asks, given the apparent, this is Michael. Michael asks, would it be better to just boycott investing in stocks or buy them and become activist shareholders?
Really fantastic question. And short answer is there's no single answer. Both can work. I tend to think these days that probably boycotting equity investments in the public market is not as effective in most spheres as people would hope. If you're dealing with tech stocks today, they're not short of capital. They don't really care whether investors sell or not on the equity markets. That's true of many other sectors. It can be a useful signal. It can be one way of indicating or ramping up pressure. It has worked to a degree in the oil and gas sector. What is more effective is looking at other parts of the capital structure, like bonds and loans, where actually there's much more immediate leverage. And if investors go on strike in the bond market and refuse to provide bond debt financing for, say, oil and gas companies, that will begin to hit quite fast, and loans in particular will hit fast. But the idea of engagement and investment is also very potent. I mean, nuns have been doing it for years in America, turning up at AGMs with placards and providing a bit of color. Groups like Engine Room Number One have done it very effectively at Exxon. And I suspect we're moving into an era where there's going to be growing amounts of engagement in oil and gas majors, precisely because, the real challenge today is transition. People like Greta Thunberg would like to divide the world into green and black, virtuous and, saints and sinners. That's how the framework is, very, very, stark differences. The reality is that if we're going to have, a transition to a lower emission world, yes, we could shut down all the oil and gas industry. That would be wonderful in some ways, but it's not going to happen politically. So the question is, how do we transition oil and gas? And that's when you have to start basically trying to deal with not a green and black world or green and brown world, but what I call an olive world, which is a mixture of green and black, a sort of muddy, greeny brown, and try and make it a greener shade of olive. And that's where engagement with companies can really be critical, because you're trying to keep the pressure up on them to essentially become greener.
I think to your point, the paper was just gotten, I think it was academic paper of the year, at least on this topic. I know Alex Edmonds was one of the co-authors of it, and they did a study that supports exactly what you just said, that you just can't have them divided to two camps and sort of tilt on the portfolio and so, right? And that there's more progress in that way.
Yes.
So this Kevin is his next question. Kevin asks, given the apparent increasing frequency of crisis, allowing for agency bias, we seem to be encountering, do you think, from an anthropological sense, that from a cognitive/cultural perspective, we are mismatched with our environment? And would this explain why we don't take more notice of the really big issues until it's too late?
Yeah, we're completely mismatched with our environment. We still have the bodies and the minds and the reflexes and the instincts of people on the grass savanna, operating as hunter-gatherers. We haven't evolved that radically. So yes, I agree. We are short-termist. We have a lack of imagination. We have all the kind of heuristic biases that people like Danny Kahneman spoke about. Short-term gratification, overreaction to some stimuli, not to others, and then we create cultural patterns which basically embed this. So to give you a tiny example, one of the reasons no one saw the credit crisis looming in 2005 was because the bankers who were at the center of this spoke this gobbledygook language no one else understood. I joke it was like financial Latin, and it was wrapped up in all these algorithms and mathematical equations and Greek letters. And culturally, in the West today, the media is trained or grows up assuming that anything with lots of Greek letters is really boring. And if it's really boring, it shouldn't be on the front page of a newspaper. And it's kind of geeky, dull. In journalistic jargon, we'd say it's just not sexy. And so it's very easy to hide things if everyone thinks it's boring.
Okay. All right, so Ina asks, how can we end planned obsolescence? Do you think that the new economic paradigm that is painfully being born right now will deal with that? Obsolescence, sorry, is the word. How do we end planned obsolescence? Sorry.
It's a really great question. It sounds very abstract, but it has immediate issues about things like this. My cell phone. Because so much of consumer culture in the last few decades has been based around the idea that you use something for a while and then chuck it away. And how we start developing a more circular economy, how do we start essentially trying to recycle things or recognize that durability is crucial. Those are really big challenges. The incentive of the companies is not designed for this right now. The fact you have things like right to repair movements, is a very good thing, and it's having some impact, but it's still at very, very early stages.
Right. So now we're coming up at 6:53. Normally we try to do a hard stop at 7, and we will have a few more minutes for questions. But if you do have time to go a bit over, because there are a lot of questions coming in, people are very interested. Do you have a few minutes to go over?
I can go over about 5 minutes, and then I have to get to another meeting, I'm afraid.
No
So
problem. No problem.
I should say, by the way, thank you so much to everyone for your interest. I really appreciate it. And it sounds like you already have access to the university to the FT and Moral Money, but do please read it, and do please let us know what you think about it, because the only way we can actually build Moral Money is by listening to people like yourselves and knowing what you're interested in and what isn't being covered.
Absolutely, we're game.
Thank you.
So, all right. So, okay, next question we have David. David asks, are there any governments that you have seen using anthropology to develop effective sustainability policies?
Really interesting question. And the short answer is not enough. There are individual anthropologists working for governments in all kinds of roles. And, I often say that the thing about anthropology is it gives you a bit of X-ray vision, and you can then go and use it almost anywhere. Or the other metaphor I use is that anthropology is a bit like salt. You can add it to other disciplines, and it binds the ingredients together like you're cooking with salt, and it makes the other flavors stand out more strongly. So anthropology plus law, anthropology plus economics, anthropology plus computer science, all of those are really powerful combinations. So anthropologists are helping governments all over the place. They've helped doing things like design bicycle lanes, cycle lanes in London. They've worked on a lot of development projects. They do a lot of stuff in the medical world. In sustainability, I don't know if there are any actually as anthropologists. I do know the Dutch government has been very active about trying to bring anthropologists in various ways. They use anthropologists in the regulator's office to try and study banks. The British Banking Standards Board, or whatever it's called, they've used anthropology research and social science research a lot to try and look at the culture of banking. And, interestingly enough, the Dutch, again, are using social scientists and anthropologists to think about things like the risks of cybersecurity and, cloud, computing, sort of quantum computing, things like that, to try and bring together both a computing science and a social science perspective. So that's not classic ESG or sustainability, but it is there.
Yeah. Okay, great. All right. Another question we have is from Arun. Arun asks, this is a bit of a preamble. It says, why regulators have been actively promoting the climate agenda following Mark Carney's landmark Tragedy of the Horizon speech in 2015. For example, the UK government codifying TCFD implementation, the UK Pensions Act 2021, mandating climate disclosures for pension schemes. Organizations and corporations have been slow to react by large, and so societal understanding of the issues has been limited. Here comes a question. What would you consider as potentially untapped assets, for example, better financial/climate literacy amongst the youth, that could potentially provide opportunities currently?
Well, you're quite right. There has been slow uptake. There's been slow awareness of what Mark was trying to say. And it's worth stressing that when Mark first made his Tragedy of the Horizon speech, that was regarded as really, really radical. And he actually was criticized by several of my colleagues at the FT for not doing proper central banking. So it's worth stressing that that was a really radical thing to do at the time. Today, it looks quite commonplace, and that's a very striking indication of how the zeitgeist has changed and how our assumptions have changed. It's taken a while for business to really embrace it, partly because it was so novel, partly because it's costly. So if you're going to do a TCFD report, it requires, hiring more auditors and accountants, and there aren't many of those who know what TCFD is, or they didn't used to be. It's partly because investors may not understand it, and it's partly because the metrics are often hard to engage with. So for all those reasons, it has been slow to take on board, to spread. But as you indicated in your question, the reality is that the younger generation is fascinated by this. This is not weird for them. And I'm always struck, and I don't know if it's true of Cambridge Judge, but when I've been to Oxford Said School of Business, I remember going there about 2 years ago and giving a speech about sustainability, and someone told me that in the past the accounting and audit classes were attended moderately well, but they were a bit like, oh God, I've got to go and do one. They weren't ultra popular. When they put the word green in front of the word audit, suddenly it was standing room only. And that's kind of indicative, I think, of the fact that you have a younger generation who kind of knows that these things matter. And above all else, want to use lateral vision to look at companies, not tunnel vision.
Well said. Okay, so we have Patrick. So we have, I think, as the thing question is going to be 2 minutes or so, right?
Okay.
Okay. So I don't want you to be late for your next meeting. Patrick asked, what are some of the ways that developing countries can become more internally innovative, especially if they will not, in the near future, have the luxury of access to money?
Yeah, crucial question, and tough to answer. Using internal resources is critical. Beg, borrow, and steal other people's ideas. There's no reason why ideas that have worked in one market can't be copied in another over and over again. You don't have to reinvent the wheel the whole time. Play the different institutions off against each other if they're going to be providing some help and know-how and resource. And also use digital tools, because COVID has caused an acceleration in digital innovation and adoption. And that is in many ways one of the great opportunities for emerging markets to leapfrog. Tiny example of this, look at what Starlink has done, Elon Musk's mobile internet platforms. You can potentially bring internet to a whole new range of places in the world now. It's got problems, not least that you have to deal with Elon Musk in the whole kind of, project and stuff like that. And there will be competitors to Starlink coming up. But, think fragmented, think lateral systems of self-organization, think digital, and think about trying to use that digital platform to steal ideas anywhere in the world that might be able to work with you.
Okay, so I'm going to squeeze one last question in, and then we will close after, right? And I'm sure we'll be on time. All right. So the last question is, I'm please everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all the questions. I do respect everyone's time here. So last question is from Arif. Can you elaborate on why VUCA is important to approach what you're advocating? And although the term has its origins in the 1990s, do you feel that it is especially well suited to a Trumpian /Brexit /COVID /Ukrainian global context since 2016? And if so, why?
Well, the essential issue is this, that, in the West, really from the middle of the 20th century onwards, or 1970s onwards, there was this assumption that, as I said before, globalization, free market capitalism, democracy were self-evidently good, supported by everyone, and would just spread across the world and become more and more deeply entrenched. And when the Berlin Wall collapsed, it was seen as evidence that that was happening. And people like Fukuyama celebrated the end of history. Yeah. And they kind of assumed that actually, they had these economic models and these balance sheets and this business world that existed kind of in isolation from everything else that was messy outside it, and you could kind of ignore it. Now, the reality is that that was a really short period of time in history when people thought that could happen. Historically, people have always known that economics and business and commerce was a social construct. The roots of the word credit come from the Latin credere, meaning to believe, because finance is about trust. The word company doesn't come from a balance sheet. It comes from the old Italian con panio, meaning with bread, because the world's first companies were actually collections of people who ate together and then did commerce together and built things together, you know, so canteens matter. And the reason I called moral money was not because I was trying to sound pious or religious. I was trying to go back to the first book of Adam Smith, which was the foundation for building markets and competition in his second book, which was the idea that it pays to have a essentially cohesive, effective, functioning social context, and the waters we swim in culturally matter. And in many ways, you know, all that's happening today with this ESG, with all the sustainability talk, is basically going back to the future. You know, we're going back to bringing together the two books of Adam Smith and trying to build sustainable business and trying to build commerce and finance in a wider social context and a wider environment, which basically takes note of both the physical environment and the social and cultural environment and how it's changing. So that's really what it's about. And I happen to think we are at a moment when the social and cultural and political and environmental, physical environment is changing fast. Hence VUCA, hence why it pays to have lateral vision and recognize the need for sustainability.
Well
Okay.
said. I couldn't think of a better way to close it. So thank you. Please let me introduce to Michael just to give closing remarks, and then we're out. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Thank you. Unfortunately, we have reached our cutoff time for today. So I would like to thank Gillian for being so gracious in making her busy schedule and to present to us today. Do remember to pick up Gillian's latest book, Anthro-Vision. It is available in Amazon. It's also in Audible. And I hope everyone has enjoyed the session as much as I have. Thank you, as always, to everyone on our events team and at the Cambridge Judge Business School who helped us to produce this event. Thank you all for joining us from all over the world in many different time zones today. Do take care and have an enjoyable rest of the night. Thank you.
Okay.